Vamos dar início à nossa primeira atividade com a apresentação do nosso convidado especial. O nosso convidado é o Doug Schepers. O Doug Schepers é do W3C, atuando na liderança de diversas iniciativas, já há bastante tempo com o W3C internacional. Particularmente, nesse momento, o Doug ele é o líder de relacionamento com o mundo dos desenvolvedores do W3C. Ele está desenvolvendo websites já desde 98 e trabalhou com front-end e faz aplicações SVG, que inclusive vai ser o tema principal dele ao abordar a Open Web Platform, SVG e visualizações de dados. Ele está com o W3C, propriamente dito, desde 2007. Ele coordena e edita as especificações para os working groups do W3C, como, por exemplo, o working group de SVG, o working group de Web Applications, o working group de Web Events, o Pointer Events e o áudio working group. Portanto, ele está atuando em diversos working groups, particularmente editando as especificações. E, atualmente, ele está bastante focado na parte de SVG e de Web Annotations. Também, ele coordenou a criação do site de documentação livre e multivendor chamado webplatform.org. E tem uma atuação já constante de apoio a desenvolvedores. Ele tem um particular carinho pela a relação com os desenvolvedores e designers, para que os desenvolvedores e os designers eles tenham voz na definição e dos padrões e na evolução da própria web. Portanto, Doug Schepers, você tem a palavra.
Bom dia, Brasil.
Bom dia.
I speak perfect Portuguese, but I think it's important for you to practice your English. So today I'll present only in English. So thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. I want to speak to you today about SVG, about the open web, about W3C, about webplatform.org, and about you. So 25 years ago, Tim Berners-Lee invented the web. 20 years ago, because there was a lot of fighting about HTML, he founded W3C. So, Tim, this is Tim. He's my boss. He makes me put his face in every presentation I do. It's very embarrassing. So, what is W3C? Who here has heard of W3C? Oh, very good. So we're an open standards organization. We do public specification development and review. We have a royalty-free license. We keep the web open. All of our members give us a license to use all of their technologies that for a particular technology for free, and that's how the web stays open. We have four host organizations, and we have 19 international offices. Our international offices make things easier they help localize, they help reach out to local businesses, and they do a lot of other things. Here in Brazil, nic.br is you can tell from my pronunciation how good my Portuguese is. nic.br is the W3C host, or W3C office, and thank you for having me. We are funded by our members, so W3C is completely funded by donations from our members. And our mission is to lead the web to its full potential. So I like to think of that as potential energy, like in physics. We will never have a perfect web, but we have a lot of possibility to do many things. So what can we do with it? What is the web, first off? The web is documents, it's data, it's media, it's applications. It's a communications and development and deployment platform for the whole world. But all of that's really boring, because that's not really what the web is. Because the web is actually people. A quarter of the world now uses the web. Over 1.6 billion people are using the web. The W3C community is about 32,000 people that subscribe to our mailing lists. We have about 1,500 active working group participants, 400 member organizations, and about 70 W3C staff like me, and about half of us are technical. So you guys, all of you, you outnumber us. You outnumber us here in this room. So we need your help to make this web and continue making this web the next generation platform for the web, for the world. So W3C makes technical specifications. We make tests to make sure that, so the technical specification says what a browser should do, what an author should do. The tests make sure that the browsers actually do that, so that when you make a feature, when you use video in HTML, SVG Telcon is starting. When you use SVG in the browser, it should work the same across browsers, and that's what tests are for. And we also now do developer documentation, and so the developer documentation is on webplatform.org, and the three of these things combined sort of make the whole infrastructure for standards and for making standards work for developers. So our technical specifications, we have hundreds of these things. We have about 180 what we call recommendations, which just means a standard. But right now, there are over 200 working drafts. So right now, the pace of standards has increased dramatically. Right now, we have more documents that we are about to publish than we have published in the past 20 years. So in the next 5 years, we will double the number of recommendations we have. So we have other things as well. We have 5 domains that we divide our work into and 20 activities. We have about 50 working groups. But all of this, it doesn't really mean anything. These are numbers. This is boring. I want to talk to you a little bit about one particular technology, SVG, and how it got started in W3C and where it's going in the future. So SVG started because some of our members said, we need vector graphics for the web. So we had a bunch of different proposals. The two big ones were PGML, maybe you've heard of Postgres oh my gosh. It's a page layout from Adobe, PGML, and VML from Microsoft largely. And this was in 1998. In 1998, we mixed all of these formats together to make SVG. This is 1998. Who here heard of SVG in 1998? Who here was alive in 1998? Okay, 3 of you were alive. Okay. Ooh, tough crowd. So you think, well, SVG is new, right? No, SVG has been around since about 1999 is when it started. I'm going to talk to you about the rise and fall of SVG. This is a good story. I mean, I'm not going to tell it well, but the story is good. So the number of people using SVG, this is very scientific. You can see that my range goes from not many people to a lot of people. Just a moment. Yes, not many to a lot. Okay, that's our scale. So when SVG started in 1998, not many people were using it. Not many people. So in 2001, Adobe released a plugin for the browsers called the Adobe SVG Viewer. This was really popular, and it started a community, and that community grew. And then Adobe adopted Flash, and they dropped support for SVG. So there was a big community from about 2000 to about 2005. Hundreds of developers, thousands of developers were using SVG, and then it died because Flash. And then, oops, oh no, okay, it's okay, I can recover. Adobe adopted Flash, and then Apple said, we aren't going to use Flash. They bet on the open web. So Apple said, iPhones will not use Flash. And Flash went, ooh. And that's when people said, oh, there's this thing called SVG. You remember SVG? Yeah. So they started using SVG. It didn't get much adoption until Internet Explorer said, okay, we're going to support SVG now. And then, boom, then you start getting Retina displays from mobile devices, iPhones, tablets, etc. And then Android finally supports SVG. And now, today, a lot of people use SVG. Hey, now a lot of people use SVG. Who here is using SVG? Look at that. That's a lot of people. When I gave this talk 4 years ago, 1, 2 hands maybe. So this is actually the power of the open web, right? It took a long time because we had entrenched power. We had companies who wanted to control how you saw the web, how you saw everything on the web. Just a few companies wanted to control it. But over time, the power of open standards, the power of the creators, basically took over and said, no, we're going to have open standards. This is the trend, right? You get some people trying to cooperate with one another, and then you get people who try to take over. But then, ultimately, those people who try to take over don't win because of the open web. That's the power of the open web. That's why this is a good story. I'm sorry I can't tell it better. So what do you use SVG for? Who here uses it for icons? If you're using SVG icons, backgrounds, like CSS backgrounds, logos. Okay. Who here is using it for data visualization? Just a few of you. Okay, so there's a library called d3.js that I want you to check out. If you use D3, it makes it very easy for you to take any data you have and convert it into beautiful interactive visualizations. People also use it for games, but actually the real use of SVG is in applications. Most people don't think of SVG as applications. First off, who here doesn't really know what SVG is? Is there anybody who doesn't know what SVG is? Okay, there's a few hands. SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphics. It's like HTML, but for graphics. Or it's like Adobe Illustrator format, but for the web. It's very simple. It's really like HTML for graphics. You can do anything you can do in HTML in SVG, except it's graphical. So this is the sort of thing you can do in SVG. That's the sort of thing you can do in SVG. The sort of thing I can do in SVG is more like this. But we all have our talents. I'm a programmer. I'm not a designer. So if you look at this, you can see how fuzzy this line is. This is the difference between a bitmap and a vector. A vector is just a set of instructions that says, hey, start here and move here. A bitmap is just a bunch of dots. A vector will be good at no matter what size of device, no matter what scale. So you can avoid pixelation, you can avoid all these problems with using vectors. So you can also script it, just like with Canvas. And you usually get smaller file sizes if you're using SVG versus most kinds of vectors or rasters. So this is really important for mobiles. This is why it's important for Retina. This is why it's important for mobile devices, because no matter what size your image is, it will always look crisp and clean. So a little bit about the shapes of SVG. So you have basically, you can make a lot of different shapes in SVG. You can have, those shapes can have a fill or a color. They can have a stroke, which is the outline. They can have a stroke width, so you can make the stroke thick, or thicker, or thinner. You can make the stroke dashed, according however you want. But basically, SVG is just a few simple shapes. You have a line, which says start here and go here. You have a rectangle, even with rounded corners and filled in with gradients, just like in CSS, but long before CSS. We had this long before CSS, rounded corners, SVG. Circles, ellipses, Does that look right? That looks wrong in the monitor. I think it looks right up there. Polyline and polygon. The only difference between a polyline and a polygon, these are both just a series of points. A polyline just doesn't connect. A polygon connects back up to itself. We're also thinking of adding things like stars and other simple shapes. And then there's the path. The path is what you're going to do most with SVG. If you are using SVG and you don't know path syntax, if you don't know how to make a path, you need to learn path. And email me and I'll tell you how. It takes you 15 minutes to learn. So these are all just simple examples of path. These are all a single element. In SVG, each shape is an element, like in HTML. Like you have a paragraph. In SVG, it's a shape. So you can have the path element, and there's one more element called the use element. And the use element says, okay, take this path, or take this shape, and copy it, and change it. But it's basically just the same path. And you can do this with more complex shapes as well, and groups of shapes. And this helps you decrease your file size. So another interesting thing about SVG is that text in SVG is text. That doesn't sound surprising, but it means that rather than putting up an image that has the word you want on it, you can use actual text in your browser. And that means it's readable, it's selectable, it's indexable, it's searchable, it's findable, it's translatable. SVG text is also stylable. You can style the fill, you can style the stroke. It supports web fonts, and you can make little shapes, paths, to put the text along the path. And it's useful for logos. So, that water's good, especially when you're nervous. So, transforms. Who has used transforms in CSS? This is great. So, transforms started in SVG, and we moved it to CSS. And that's a trend that we're trying to continue in SVG, is to move things into CSS as much as possible. So, I'm going to tell you a little trick about transforms. When you draw something, you're drawing it on a piece of graph paper, right? You're drawing it on a coordinate grid. But when you transform something, you're not actually changing the shape, you're changing its underlying coordinate grid. So if you translate something, if you move it, you're actually moving the whole coordinate grid. If you rotate it, you're rotating the coordinate grid. If you scale it, you're changing the size of the grid. So skewing X and Y, and then there's matrix. So this is sort of how you should remember this when you're doing transformations, because there's weird little tricks that sometimes you'll say, well, this isn't doing what I expected to do. Because it might be because you're actually transforming, you think you're transforming the shape, but you're actually transforming the grid underneath it. Anyway, SVG also has animation. You can use CSS animation, or Smile, which is another declarative animation. You can use script. There's a lot of script libraries out there that help you use script. And there's easing with key splines. There's a new animation specification that's coming out in the next, probably in the next year or so. It's going to be complete, and it's already started. Firefox is driving this. So we'll see even better animations in the future. And like I said, with SVG, you can script. You can view the source. You can debug. Let's inspect the element there. So here I'm looking at this element, and it says inspect element. Let's change that to inspect elephant. Oop. And you can see it changes live in the DOM. So SVG is just like HTML. You can change the graphics right here in the browser. Oh, by the way, all these slides are SVG, of course. I didn't mention that. So you can generate images programmatically, or client-side or server-side. Using libraries like D3 it makes it really easy to make data visualizations, for example. You can add interactivity animation. You can draw something in Illustrator, and then you can bring it in. You can make it interactive and animated. So here is an example of responsive images. So you can also, reload that there. Just sorry. This is There we are. So this is, you've probably seen this. This is the SVG logo. HTML logo, sorry. And you all use media queries, right? So when you're making a responsive site, with SVG, you can also use media queries just like you can in HTML. So I'm going to shrink this down, and as I shrink it, to make it simpler, I'm going to remove that HTML, just remove that element. And then as I get it even smaller, if I want to use it for an icon, for example. Can you guys see that? Oh, yeah. So you can see here, it has the colored background. I love this laser pointer. You've got the colored background, you have the 5, I shrink it down, and boom. You see the 5, I made the color, it was a single color for the 5, I got rid of the background, I made the SVG, I made the 5 itself a little bigger compared to the box. And this is not surprising, but many people don't realize that you can use SVG responsively. So that makes it useful for, there we are. Yes. That makes it useful for mobile devices, and this just tells you more about that. Another thing about mobile devices, just very briefly, this image, the big image, the small image, and the very small image, those are all the same image. It's just I used them at different sizes, and so I showed and hid different parts of the SVG to make it better. What is that buzzing? I'm going to take this out. Yeah, I'm going to take this out until I need it. Sorry for that buzzing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about accessibility too, because it's a concern when you're using something that's graphical. You have to start thinking about how somebody who can't see it is going to interpret that. And they aren't the only person who might interpret that. A lot of people have to use, they can see, but they can't see that well, so they have to zoom in the page. And this probably looks a little bit like what they have to see. And it also probably looks a little bit like what you see when you look on a phone with a web page that isn't responsive. So when you're making an image, make sure to make it responsive. In general, when you're thinking about making a responsive website, you're also thinking about making it accessible, because the same sort of problems that you have for accessibility are the same sort of problems you're going to have for mobiles. One of the other things about SVG is that like HTML, you can use ARIA. Who here has used ARIA? Anybody? Few of you. ARIA is a way of saying, hey, I have this shape here, and I know it's just a div or it's a paragraph or whatever, but actually I'm telling you it's a button. And that way people who use a screen reader is a way of listening to the elements on the screen and or interacting with the elements on the screen. You have a way of telling the screen reader, this thing is not a paragraph, this is actually a button. The difference between these two buttons is not the color. The difference is that this one is not a button because it doesn't have ARIA on it. It's just an image. It might look like a button to us, but it doesn't look like a button to a blind person. This one over here looks like a button. I just used roll button, and I used some CSS to style it. And so if I press this, I'm going to change the style. Boom, I changed the style, and boom, it takes care of the color change for me as well, just by a CSS rule. But it also means that a blind person can press that button and it works for them. There's some other things about ARIA that I won't go into, except for to say if you're using these things, you should make sure that your controls are tab focusable. So, demo. Everybody likes a demo. I'm going to show you a demo of a little app I wrote called Describler, and it just helps you make an image accessible. So you can upload any SVG image to Describler. It's at describler.com. And first off, it tells you what the shape looks like. So as I So let's see, let's find a good example. So here, this is, it just makes a little tree on the side for you, and it just tells you which element you have. And it tells you if there's a title for it. SVG, there's something you can do called a title element, and it's basically just, it's you know how you view a title on your HTML page? Each element in SVG can have a title. So even though you can't see the word Saturday 8 hours, it's hidden inside this path. So a blind person will encounter that, and I'm just going to show you what it might sound like to them. Oops, but first I'm going to plug in the sound.
Monday, 4 hours. Tuesday, 12 hours. Y-axis labels 1, 2 hours working on this presentation. Saturday, 8 hours. Sunday, 6 hours. Monday, 4 hours. Tuesday, 12 hours.
So you can see the blind person, even though it's a visualization, a blind person still sees or still hears what's in the presentation. And it's very easy to do. You just add a little title in it that says, what is this bar representing? What does this dot represent? And one of the other nice things about SVG being text and about using data visualization with SVG is that you can translate it. So I made last night a version of this same bar chart in Portuguese. Now, my browser, unlike me, does not speak Portuguese, but you can listen to what it thinks it sounds like. Or maybe you can't.
Sober Esther presents a tilde paragraph a tilde poundo, s a tilde bado, 8 horas, domingo, 6 horas, segundo FEIRA, 4 horas, terra paragraph FEIRA, 12 horas, RA tulos do IXO Y. 1.
Yeah, it doesn't really speak Portuguese, I'm sorry. So this is using the web speech API from Google and Mozilla. And I think it's supported by Apple as well. So here's another example. First off, who can tell me what this bar chart or this line chart represents? Can anybody guess? Well, no, it is in SVG, yes. But who can tell me what the visualization is of? Can you read it and figure it out? It's a stock market crash. This is the sort of thing, by the way, that accessibility people. Okay, so here I just made a stock market chart. You know, in 2007, here I use the laser pointer. In 2007, you know, you were at 1,300, and then around late 2007, you started dropping. Mid 2008, you were at about 7,500, and then it slowly recovered after that. So another thing you can do with SVG is you can read the data. Not just like we can just look at this and we see the trend. We say, oh, it's a little bit high, it goes up a little bit, and then it starts dropping, it goes really low, and then it comes back up slowly. Okay, we can see that. A blind person couldn't see that you see that trend, but they can hear it. So, oops. And I'm going to stop that because it's really annoying. I need to work on the sound. But the idea, all I'm doing here is, this is an application in SVG. I have a line, and I have a cursor. And this cursor, as I drag it over the screen, you see that little dot, it finds the intersection point. It uses the Web Audio API. Do you know the Web Audio API? The Web Audio API lets you generate sound in your browser. You can make music, like the beautiful music I made here. You can make data audio, what are called visualizations or sonifications. You can make graphics to go along with music. You can do all sorts of things with the Web Audio API. And you can even connect up musical instruments to your browser. So I just use this and I create a sine wave. And I say, okay, if this SVG line is at a certain point, I'm going to generate a low sine wave, a low sound. And if it's at a high point, I'm going to generate a high one. This is because SVG is a programmable format that you can read and write. So just a little bit more about the idea of accessibility. I know many of you are thinking, oh, accessibility, I don't really care that much about accessibility. But accessibility is not, first off, it's not a burden. It's fun. It's actually fun to think about how you can make your information more satisfying to all your users. And there's something called the pictorial superiority effect. And it says that basically 75% of your sensory processing in your brain is given over to vision. So all the other senses, your tactile, auditory, taste, smell, those are all just 25%. The brain is predisposed to understand things visually. And this is why why SVG and graphics are actually good for accessibility, because for people who have cognitive disabilities or other problems, SVG is actually, or rather, not just SVG, but any graphical representation is helpful to those people. So one of the things about the pictorial superiority effect is that your memory retention, if somebody shows you if I gave you this presentation and I didn't have images, after 3 days, you would remember about 10% of it. With images, you retain about 65%. Your brain sees those images and it says, oh, I understand this, and it puts them together and it helps you retain information. So when you're presenting things, there's actually an accessibility case for you to actually do things graphically as well as to have them in a text format. So this effect actually increases with age. Little kids, this doesn't matter. By the time you reach your age, it started to really take hold. By the time you reach my age, well, you're almost dead, so it doesn't matter. But it increases as you get older. If you're interested in learning more about how the brain processes visual information, or just process information in general, there's a great book called Brain Rules by John Medina. And to go along with this idea, you have several learning modes. You have the visual learning mode, auditory, tactile, and reading and writing. If you combine any two of these, it helps people learn faster, and it helps people remember longer. And if you combine that with an emotional effect, like a picture of a kitten, or maybe something more important, but something that makes somebody feel something, excites them, they think something they think is beautiful, it actually amplifies that even more. So when you're thinking about trying to present information on the web, think about how visually you're doing this. And you don't have to use SVG for this, but SVG is a great medium for that. And then just one last thing about that visual bias. So who here thinks that red is the bigger area? Red or yellow? Red. It is red, but it's actually red by quite a big margin. Most people think that yellow is actually much bigger than it is. And this is because bright colors make a stronger impression. When you're thinking about doing your graphics, think about how the colors are, what impression the colors are making. It also shows that pie charts suck. A little bit more about colors. When you're doing colors, and I'm going to cut this a little quick. There's something called a Brewer palette. The Brewer palette is a great set of colors that were originally used for maps, and there's 3 different kinds. There's discrete, sequential, and diverging. Discrete is for quantitative, so if they're just different kinds of things that you want to represent. Sequential is when there's things of the same sort, but they have different degrees. And diverging is when you want a range from one thing to another. So these were originally developed for maps, And so you see here, you have a nice layout that has, this is Australia, I should have done Brazil. But you can also use patterns in SVG. And when I said that you should make things attractive, I was not talking about this. You should make things more attractive than that. You can't really see that very well. But this does help with tactile maps if you're using SVG and printing out SVG. And then the last thing I'll say about accessibility is that you should make things beautiful, but you should also make them simple, because nobody can understand this, and absolutely nobody can understand this. So when you're trying to do visualizations in SVG, or in anything, whether it's a page layout or it's a visualization, make things simple, and that's going to make it easier for people for it to be accessible, and it's going to make it easier for everybody to understand. I'll just move over this. So how do you create SVG? If you want to make images, you can use Adobe Illustrator. You can Inkscape, which is an open source program. I think actually Yuka, one of the developers for Inkscape, is here, maybe not in this room, but he's here at the conference. You should talk to him. So you have some Brazilians who are working on Inkscape. And there's a program called SVG Edit. If you want to do script and animations, D3 is a really great program, a really great JavaScript library for data visualizations, and snap.svg from Adobe helps you make animations. You can also use VI or Emacs if you're a real programmer. So a lot of people have asked me, when should you use SVG and when should you use Canvas? So SVG is document-based and Canvas is script-based. SVG uses vectors. Canvas uses pixel operations. I won't go into more of the details, but basically it's SVG scales better. SVG has an object model with hit testing and events, so if I click on a shape, SVG says, oh, you clicked on the circle. If you do this with Canvas, you don't have that. You have to do that manually. SVG, if you have a large number of shapes, hundreds and maybe thousands of shapes, SVG, you're probably going to see some performance problems. Whereas with Canvas, you have fast rendering no matter how many elements. SVG is accessible. Canvas, you have to make an accessible equivalent. But really, you should use both. You should figure out which one you're using for which purpose. For example, SVG, good for user interfaces. Canvas, better for fast-paced games. SVG has scalable images. Canvas, use that for much more visually complex images. SVG, use that with interactive animations. Canvas, if you're really making really highly dynamic visualizations like wind patterns or things like that, use Canvas for that. And SVG, I generally say, is for designers, and Canvas is for developers, but I am a developer and I use SVG, so I'm not sure that's good advice. So what is the future of SVG? Closer integration with HTML and CSS. That's one of our main priorities. We want to make it as, most of you, if I asked who uses CSS here, everybody would raise their hand. So who uses CSS here? I said everybody raises their hand. So we want to make SVG much easier to use with CSS. We're going to have a single animation model. We're going to improve for JavaScript, SVG, and CSS. We're going to improve the DOM APIs to make it easier to program to. We're going to add more visual effects. That car effect you saw earlier is what's called a mesh gradient, and you can kind of do that in SVG today, but it's harder, and so we're going to add that. And we're going to have more core functionality. We're going to add new shapes. We're going to make it easy to add wrapped text. Yes, it's 2014, and SVG text can't be wrapped. You have to do that manually. But in 2015, you'll be able to wrap the text. And we're also adding a new capability. So you've probably heard of a Bezier curve. This is what a curve in SVG would look like. So you have 4 points, and you want to make this into a curve. We actually have to add 6 more points in order to make that curve. It's powerful, but it's kind of harder to use. We are adding a new capability to SVG that basically when you just put in a series of points, it just draws a curved line between them. It's called a Catmull-Rom curve. So that's coming up in SVG 2. That's one thing. So I've talked to you a little bit about one example of a web technology, right? SVG, how it started, how it came through, what the nature of SVG is. And if you want to learn more, you can go to webplatform.org. You can also use Google or Bing if you prefer Bing. But webplatform.org is more than just a place to learn about things. It's actually a place for you to help. So there's a number of ways you can get involved in W3C. You can read the specifications. If you're very technical, you can read the specifications and give us public feedback. There's also W3C community groups. If you say, hey, W3C, there's something that's really missing from the web. I'm doing this, we're doing this thing, and we really want to have a new feature for not just SVG, for anything. You can form a community group around that. Community groups are completely free. Anybody can join. You can say to your friends, hey, help me figure out how we should solve this problem. And you can propose new ideas to W3C, and we a lot of those ideas we take up and we turn into standards. You can also help us document the web at webplatform.org. You can write documentation yourself if you're good in English or good in Portuguese. You can also translate articles from English into Portuguese to make it more accessible to your fellow developers down here in Brazil and around the world. Where else do they speak Portuguese? Portugal, I guess. And other countries. Congratulations. And then finally, you can write tests at testthewebforward.org. Writing tests means maybe it doesn't help you today. If you write a test, if you're seeing a problem and you say, okay, this browser it works, this browser it doesn't work, and this browser I'm not even sure what they're thinking. You can write a test for that. You can submit it to W3C, and it's like writing a bug report to a browser. When you write a test for webplatform.org to test the web forward, it basically says to all the browsers, this is the one way that it should be done. If you're interested in doing any of these activities, you can come talk to me afterwards. So one last thing. I mentioned that W3C is 20 years old and the web is 25 years old. You can tweet your experience of the web in the last 25 years if you are even 25 years old. And we're having a symposium in October. It's a show. If you can't make it up to San Francisco, you can see the live video stream. We hope that you'll watch that. And finally, I hope that the impression I gave to you is that W3C and the web, this is not some all-powerful organization. This is just a bunch of people who have gotten together, who believe in the web, and who want to make the web better. And so you guys are part of those people. We all have a lot of work to do if we want to keep the web open, if we want to make sure that one company doesn't control the whole web, but rather we all control the web. So I hope you'll join in with W3C to help keep the web open. Thanks for your attention. My name is Doug Schepers. That's my email address. I'm Shepazoo on Twitter. And I have stickers.
Bom, em primeiro lugar, muito obrigado, Doug Schepers, pela sua exposição, explanação inicial, abordando um aspecto importante da Open Web Platform, que é o SVG, e pela sua precisão estatística também de ver que o SVG já está sendo usado por muitos. Não sabemos exatamente quanto, mas são muitos, né? Isso também é um motivo de satisfação. A gente vai abrir para as perguntas. Eu vou pedir para vocês que façam as perguntas em português, porque nós estamos fazendo o streaming dessa sessão. E a tradutora, então, traduz para ele. Então, aqueles que tiverem perguntas, por favor, levante a mão, porque as nossas assistentes podem levar a mão até vocês o microfone. Então, já levantem a mão para facilitar, ok? Temos um aqui, depois outro lá. Ok? Por favor, se identifique, tá? E que organização trabalha e faça a pergunta.
Bom, primeiro, obrigado, Doug, pela fantástica apresentação. Realmente expandiu minha visão do uso do SVG. São duas perguntas. A mais importante é como eu consigo um sticker. E a segunda é como que o SVG pode ajudar no combate à fragmentação tecnológica da distribuição de aplicações, principalmente no ambiente mobile, onde cada vez mais as aplicações são nativas e a gente está buscando utilizar tecnologias web para a distribuição dessas aplicações. Se o SVG ele traz algum caso de uso que seja interessante para suportar múltiplas plataformas, ainda assim se beneficiando do canal de distribuição das lojas de aplicações. É isso.
It's a good question. I'm going to take this off because I'll get distracted just a second. So that's a good question. I'm going to challenge your question, though, because you say more and more applications are using the native platform. In fact, mobile phones, mobile devices have always used native. Native applications were there first. The web, more and more people are using web technologies. So we can see now it's, I don't know, 60-40 or 70-30, whatever it is. It's not that people are using native applications instead of web technologies. People are starting to use web technologies instead of native. And SVG works in every modern mobile device. So you can use SVG anywhere that you have a modern mobile device, starting with, I think, Android 3. SVG combined, because SVG is just part of the platform, like HTML or JavaScript or CSS, you can combine it with all those other technologies. So you could use, for example, geolocation with SVG. You can use battery or network information or anything else that you can use with HTML. You can use that with SVG. And with SVG, you have a richer graphical aspect. There is a challenge. There's a performance challenge with mobile web, and there is a tools challenge with mobile web, and also an API challenge. You have more capabilities on for native apps have more capabilities than the web does right now. But those native capabilities are being brought into the web. So now the native capabilities are as good as they're ever going to be. The web is just going to keep increasing in its capabilities until it is as good as native and better, because it also has all the power of the web. And tooling is going to improve as well. There's a lot of people working on tools to make it easier to develop for native-like applications for the web. So I think I agree with you that it's something we need to work hard to we at W3C, we call that closing the gap with native. So there's some capabilities that you can do with native that you can't yet do with the web, and we're making that go away. The sticker is, you just come to me, it's 500 real. But for you, 50.
Oi, tudo bem? Eu sou o Natan. Eu primeiramente agradecer aí a palestra, Doug. E eu acredito que com SVG, né, tem boas práticas, né, que o pessoal assim tenta praticar. Eu queria saber se é tranquilo, se é ok utilizar o Illustrator e exportar para SVG, e se isso, sei lá, é bem visto ou se deixa o código muito sujo, não sei.
Illustrator keeps getting better. Their output is better. Inkscape is also improving their output. But if I'm perfectly honest, I think it's not very good. There are applications that I've talked to them about improving it. They are improving it. if there are simpler SVG Edit, actually, which is a web-based drawing program. Their code is actually much better. It makes it easier. Are you a programmer or a designer? Okay. If you were a programmer, I would tell you it's actually not that hard to learn SVG. Just learn to hand code it. But I would say probably your best, I mean, there are ways you can clean up the SVG. Are you comfortable with CSS? Okay, SVG is different than CSS, but it's not much harder. You can go into, another nice thing about SVG is it's a text format. It's like CSS, it's like HTML. Open up the file from Illustrator. First off, you say export to web, and you can say export as simple SVG, something like that. So make it as simple as possible. And use a lot of layers, or use layers when it's appropriate. So if you have a shape, if you put it in layers, that translates as a group in SVG. And so you can transform, you can change around groups and things like that. That makes it, keeping your SVG organized in Illustrator is the best way to have good output in SVG. So I would say just get in, if you're comfortable using HTML and CSS, just look at an SVG file and remove an element and then put it back. Play with it in the inspector, right? Change colors, things like that. You'll become familiar with it. And all of my SVGs, everything you saw drawn up there, I did by hand, except for that car, the good car. I didn't do the good car, I did the bad car. All of that I did in a text editor, everything. So it's really not hard to do. And it will, so you can take something out of Illustrator and you can play around with it and you can say, oh, I'm having this problem with it. Play around with the file and just tweak it, and then you can actually make it interactive and hopefully work for you. If you have a problem, email me and we'll talk about it.
Sou o Richard do Hotel Urbano. Eu queria falar queria saber um pouco mais sobre a aplicação de font icons e SVG sprites e como que está o andamento disso daí, como que se existe alguma aplicação, se estão desenvolvendo alguma coisa para otimizar o processo de utilização de SVG sprites e se tem alguma alternativa válida também para no próprio SVG para fazer essa diretiva de font icons.
That's a great question. I should have put something about that in my presentation. In the newest release of iOS, they just improved a number of different things, but two of the things were directly related to SVG for using SVG sprites. So now in the newest iOS, you have SVG sprites. And I think they were the last mobile browser that didn't let you use SVG sprites. So now SVG sprite, does everybody know what a sprite is? I'll explain a sprite very briefly. A sprite is when you have one image and let's say you have 5 different icons or three different icon states. You know, you have that icon in 3 colors, and so when somebody mouses over it, it changes to the different state. So you can do the same technique in SVG. And so we are trying to improve SVG sprites in the standard. There's one last problem that we've been talking, that font icons are good, but there's a number of challenges with them, including the fact that you can only have one color with a font icon. With SVG, you can have icons with multiple colors. And there is I'll say a bug with SVG that when you get very small sizes, you sometimes lose some of the crispness because of anti-aliasing. And Microsoft and Mozilla, at the last meeting of the SVG working group, sat down together and they're working on a proposal together to make it possible to do hinting with SVG, so you can completely replace everything that you can do font icons with SVG. Not today, but in the near future.
Mais uma questão?
Meu nome é Demian Borba, eu trabalho na BlackBerry e assim, primeiramente, parabéns pela palestra, foi fantástica, adorei. E para complementar um pouco a pergunta do Illustrator aqui, talvez as pessoas não saibam ainda, mas lá no Illustrator CC, se você fizer um desenho mais complexo, com gradiente, sombra, o que você quiser, você seleciona ele no Illustrator, lá com o seu AI aberto, seleciona o que você quer, copia e vai para qualquer editor de texto e cola, ele já cria lá a tag SVG, tudo bonitinho para você e funciona. E eu tenho usado isso no mundo real e tem funcionado super bem. Valeu, obrigado.
Perguntas para ganhar sticker? Opa, ó, já levantaram, né?
Bom dia, meu nome é Leonardo, sou desenvolvedor web também há pouco tempo. E eu já tinha ouvido falar de SVG, mas nunca tinha procurado estudar, saber mais ir a fundo. Para quem, agora, depois da palestra, eu fiquei interessado. Para quem vai começar, você recomenda começar por onde? Qual que é melhor? Porque tem a questão da semântica, que é muito importante, como outro amigo ali abordou, e a gente sempre procura fazer um código limpo, né?
That's a great question. They're all great questions. I would like to say go to webplatform.org, but we're still starting on our SVG documentation. Now we're finishing up CSS and HTML. It's a new project. MDN is a good place to learn some stuff. But the problem is it's hard to know where to start with SVG, and that is a problem. We're going to make developer documentation on webplatform.org. But I think the first thing you should do, are you a developer or designer, both? Both? A little bit of both? Designer, okay. So the first thing you should start with is don't think about starting with SVG. Think about starting with what you want to do. Why do you want to use SVG? Why do you want to have something graphical? What are you trying to convey to your audience, to your readers? What idea are you trying to put forward? And then you start, right? So you take the idea, you draw it out, put it on a piece of paper, and then say, okay, I want to do this thing. Now I'm going to use SVG to do it. So if you want to learn SVG, first I would say use something like Illustrator. Use a tool that you already know. Make very simple shapes, and then export them, and then with the text editor, combine them together and just play with it and see how it, just like you would play with HTML and CSS, just play with it and experiment and see how, maybe make an illustration, or not an illustration, I'm sorry, an animation. Maybe make a sun and the earth and figure out how to make them rotate around one another and figure out how to make an eclipse or do whatever you want to do. Do very simple things. Snap.svg from Adobe makes some of this stuff much easier, and it's a script library. But I would say that for any designer, unless you just are not technical at all, you should probably learn how to use the code. And using the code makes you a more powerful developer. It makes you a more powerful web professional. Knowing how to use the code is like knowing. If you don't know how to do HTML or CSS, there's only so many things you're going to be able to do as a professional. If you know how to use HTML and CSS, your world opens up. Play around with the SVG. That's how I started. I looked at the numbers and I said, oh, I bet if I change this number, this other thing will happen. So if I had a path, I will change one number and see, oh, what does it do? And that way you get a feel for it. It's just like when you draw. When you first started drawing, you were terrible. Not you, I mean, we're all terrible when we first start drawing. But then you start learning techniques and you don't even have to think about it anymore. Now you have something and you make that. Take that perspective and bring that to coding and say, I have this visual shape I want to do. How do I make that in the code? And it's not terribly hard, and it gets easier over time. And I'm not suggesting that anybody really hand codes things, but if you know what Illustrator is doing, you have a better idea of how to model what you're doing in the browser, or what you're doing in the drawing tool, and what's going to come out in the browser. And also, if you have questions, really email me. There's a Brazilian guy who works on webplatform.org, and if you don't speak good English, we can work together and we can figure something out. I am serious. If anybody has questions about how to use SVG, we can work together to make a tutorial for webplatform.org, and then we can share that with everybody.
Bom, dá espaço para uma questão a mais, porque os stickers acabaram, então a última questão.
Eu sou o Anderson Lima Alves, trabalho na Data Transit e trabalho tanto com animação e design. Gostaria de saber se, das ferramentas que você citou, qual que se assemelha mais, porque o Google tem uma ferramenta que desenvolve Canvas, tem o Flash, qual que seria a ferramenta que se assemelha mais a essas ferramentas que a gente já conhece?
I'll be honest. I think that the tools you have available for SVG animation are not very mature right now. I think that there's a market for this. I think that people want to do this, and I can't tell you much more, but I know that there is a project that's being worked on right now to make it easy, an authoring tool for SVG animation, but I can't tell you any more than that. But in the next few months, in the next year or so, I think you will see probably better tools for SVG animation coming out.
Ok, vamos encerrar. Quero agradecer muito ao Doug Schepers. Thank you very much for your great presentation.